The Capitol was nearly empty when Lee Atwater stepped into the marble walkway, the night echoing faintly beneath the dim overhead lights. Ahead of him, an aging committee clerk, someone Lee barely recognized, quietly locked his office door and walked toward the exit, carrying a thin, outdated file. The man shouldn't have been on duty this late, and the date stamped on the folder shouldn't have existed anymore. Lee slowed as he watched the old committee clerk move down the corridor with a kind of weary precision, each step careful, almost rehearsed, like someone who had walked these halls longer than most people had held office. His grey coat hung slightly uneven over his shoulders, and the thin file tucked under his arm looked older than the man himself. It wasn't just outdated. It was from an entire legislative cycle most of Washington had quietly agreed to forget. The clerk didn't notice Lee at first. He simply kept walking, head lowered, as though trying to slip out of the building without leaving a trace. Lee recognized that posture. It belonged to people who didn't want their lateness questioned, not because they were hiding something dramatic, but because they didn't want to explain something small that would inevitably lead to something larger. When the clerk reached the far end of the hallway, he paused beneath a flickering light. The bulb hummed softly, its pulse creating a faint halo around him. He shifted the folder in his hands, adjusting it as if the angle mattered. Lee knew that gesture too. People adjusted old files when they carried weight, political weight, personal weight, weight that shouldn't still exist. Lee stepped forward, letting his shoes brush deliberately against the floor. The sound was soft, but in a building this empty, it was enough. The clerk turned slightly, startled, his glasses catching the dim light. Recognition flickered across his face, hesitant, uncertain, halfway between respect and dread. Didn't expect anyone else on this floor. The clerk said, voice low. Neither did I, Lee replied. The clerk nodded toward the file almost unconsciously. Just finishing some old business. Lee raised an eyebrow. At this hour? The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone else to emerge from the shadow. Some things are easier to handle when the building is quiet, he said. Lee didn't press, not yet. Instead, he let the silence settle, letting the older man feel the weight of being observed. People spoke differently when they sensed the moment mattered. That file, Lee said calmly. It looks familiar. The clerk tightened his grip. A small tremor passed through his fingers, barely visible but unmistakable. It shouldn't, he answered. Most records from that period were archived or removed. Removed. The word hung in the air like dust. Lee's gaze sharpened. The clerk shifted again, pulling the folder closer to his chest, as if shielding it from the corridor itself. For a moment, neither of them moved, the hallway stretching long and quiet around them, carrying only the muted sound of distant ventilation. What's in it? Lee asked quietly. The clerk exhaled, slow, controlled, resigned. Something that was supposed to stay buried, he said. But tonight felt like the right time to finish closing the door. He turned toward the exit, but his pace had changed, slightly faster, slightly less steady. Lee watched him go, the thin file pressed tightly under the man's arm, its edges frayed, its label faded to near invisibility. Whatever it contained, it wasn't routine cleanup. It was something with a pulse, something someone wanted silenced, not forgotten. And Lee felt the familiar shift in the air, the sense that he had stepped into a night already in motion. Lee watched the clerk's retreating figure until it reached the end of the corridor, where the exit door's small window cast a thin rectangle of light across the floor. The man paused there, as if reconsidering something, whether to leave, whether to speak, whether he should have been carrying that file at all. Then, with a quiet push, he stepped through and disappeared into the stairwell. Lee remained still for a moment, not frozen, calculating. The old clerk wasn't a player in Washington's power circles. He wasn't someone who shaped votes or steered alliances. He was the kind of man who understood where papers were stored, how long things stayed in the system, and which records weren't supposed to resurface. People like him didn't carry forgotten files after midnight, unless something had gone wrong, or unless someone had asked them to. Lee moved toward the stairwell door, but didn't open it. Instead, he studied the floor, a faint trail of dust, disturbed only in a narrow pattern, marked the clerk's hurried exit. The building's custodial staff had cleaned earlier. These footprints hadn't existed an hour ago. Whoever the clerk had passed on the way out, if anyone at all, had stayed light on their feet. He turned away from the exit and examined the wall near the clerk's office. The door was locked as expected, but something subtle stood out, a small rectangular indentation on the paint just above the doorknob, the mark left by years of a keyring hitting the wall. Only this one was fresh, the paint slightly scraped. The clerk had opened that door in a hurry tonight. Lee stepped back, considering the angles. If the clerk had rushed inside, retrieved a 10-year-old file, and chosen this particular night to remove it from the building, it meant two possibilities. He'd been instructed, or he'd been pressured. Lee's instincts leaned toward the former. Pressure left panic. Tonight, the clerk carried resignation. As he walked deeper into the hallway, Lee passed a row of offices long since dark. Behind one frosted window, he caught the faint reflection of himself moving. Tired shoulders, steady gait, eyes trained on the spaces where silence pooled. In Washington, what wasn't said had always mattered more than what was. Halfway down the corridor, he stopped. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, not dangerous but absurd, as if someone had been standing there minutes earlier, leaving behind a lingering stillness that hadn't yet dissolved. Lee knew that sensation too well. Late-night politics had a rhythm, and tonight's rhythm carried an extra beat. Someone else had been on this floor. Maybe still. He glanced toward the elevator. Its panel light flickered faintly, like a heartbeat muffled behind steel. It hadn't moved recently, but that meant nothing. Anyone cautious enough to operate after hours would use the stairs. Lee exhaled slowly, letting his breath steady his thought. Whatever was inside that clerk's file wasn't the story. Not yet. The story was why it had resurfaced now, why the clerk looked like he'd been waiting for a cue, and why the building felt like it was watching itself. He continued walking, shoes brushing softly against the carpet, each step a quiet measure of intent. Lee didn't chase shadows, he followed patterns, and tonight a pattern was forming. Subtle, controlled, deliberate, the kind that didn't happen by accident. Lee reached the midpoint of the hallway and paused near a small alcove where a payphone had once been mounted. The metal bracket still clung to the wall, empty now, but dust patterns around it revealed it had been used as a resting point earlier in the night. Someone had leaned there, waiting, not long ago, long enough to leave an imprint, short enough to vanish before Lee arrived. He examined the floor. A faint smudge of dark shoe polish curved toward the corridor's bend. Not the clerk's. His shoes were scuffed, old, uneven. This mark was smoother, more deliberate, made by someone who walked with intention rather than fatigue. Lee didn't follow the trail immediately. Instead, he looked toward the distant stairwell door the clerk had used. It remained still now, no trace of movement, but the memory of the man's face lingered. The quiet tension behind the eyes, the way he held the file as if it were both a burden and a final task. The clerk hadn't been fleeing something. He'd been finishing something. Lee turned and continued down the hallway, passing portraits of past committee leaders. Their frames gleamed faintly in the dim light, faces staring ahead with the fixed confidence of people who believed their decisions would stand forever. Yet the corridor itself felt different tonight, less certain, more vulnerable. He reached a small office labeled Subcommittee Records, Auxiliary, a room rarely used after the restructuring years earlier. The frosted glass window showed no silhouette, but the door was slightly ajar, the latch resting softly instead of locked into place. Lee pushed it open with 2 fingers. The room was nearly dark, lit only by the glow from a desk lamp that had been left on its lowest setting. Papers covered the surface, not in chaos, but in deliberate arrangement. Someone had sorted them, stacked them, and removed specific pieces. The empty spaces between the stacks told the story more loudly than the documents themselves. At the center of the desk lay a blotter with an indent, a rectangular outline about the size of the file the clerk had been carrying. Lee stepped inside, scanning everything without touching. His eyes caught a detail near the edge of the desk, a small scrap of paper torn unevenly, left behind as if by accident. He leaned in, only a fragment of typed text remained, "Review withheld pending." The rest had been torn away. He straightened, feeling the room's stillness settle around him. This wasn't the kind of place someone wandered into spontaneously. It was where older matters were meant to sleep, files that didn't need revisiting. Decisions sealed quietly, and yet someone had revisited it tonight. Lee moved toward the door again, but stopped when he noticed something on the floor near the wastebasket, a small brass key, the kind used for internal filing cabinets. It lay half hidden in shadow, as though dropped in haste or left in tension. He picked it up, turning it slightly under the faint light. No tag, no number, no indication of what cabinet it belonged to, just a key waiting for a lock. Lee slipped it into his coat pocket and surveyed the room one final time. Whatever the old clerk had taken from here, the act wasn't random. It wasn't personal either. It was procedural, something that had been left undone for years and now demanded closure. As he stepped back into the hallway, Lee felt the subtle shift in the building again, the quiet presence hovering at the edge of perception. Someone had been one step ahead of him tonight. Whoever they were, they weren't finished. Lee stepped back into the corridor, letting the door to the subcommittee records room close quietly behind him. The faint click echoed farther than it should have in the empty hallway, as though the building itself was listening closely. He paused, giving his eyes a moment to adjust to the dim overhead lights, and then began walking again with the same steady cadence he'd carried all night. He wasn't chasing anyone. He wasn't running from anything. He was following the shape of a pattern beginning to reveal itself. Halfway down the hall, he stopped at another office door marked Archive Index, Enter now use. Unlike the previous room, this door was locked. The brass knob had the faint warmth of recent contact, though someone had tried it earlier or had exited recently. But there were no footprints, no papers, nothing disturbed. Whoever had checked the room had chosen not to enter. Lee looked back at the junction of the corridors behind him. The shadows held their silence but carried a subtle rhythm, almost like the night was adjusting around him. He had felt this before, in different buildings, under different circumstances, whenever information was moving quietly without official channels. He continued walking until he reached a small observation window overlooking the courtyard. From here, the Capitol grounds were visible in their late-night stillness. Trimmed hedges, silent flagpoles, darkened service paths. The kind of view custodial staff appreciated, but strategists rarely saw. As Lee leaned closer, he noticed something odd in the reflection of the glass, not outside, but behind him. For a fraction of a second, a silhouette appeared at the far end of the hallway, not close enough to identify, but unmistakably a person. Lee didn't turn immediately. Instead, he remained still, eyes on the glass. The silhouette lingered. Then, with a faint shift of shadow, it disappeared into the corner. Only then did Lee turn his head. The corridor was empty. He didn't follow. Whoever that was, they weren't threatening him. They were verifying something, watching whether he would stay on the path. They were gauging his interest, measuring his reactions. He exhaled slowly and resumed moving, this time toward the far wing of the floor. As he walked, he reached into his coat and felt the small brass key he had taken from the records room. It sat cold and solid, a physical anchor to the night's sequence of signals. The clerk's withdrawn expression, the old file, the deliberate notes, the unlocked office, the missing documents, the silent watcher in the corridor. None of it pointed to a crisis. It pointed to a choice. Someone wanted Lee to unlock something, literally or figuratively, and they were leaving it to him to decide which direction he was willing to follow. He reached another junction point and stopped. Here, the building grew older, the walls holding echoes of legislative sessions long past. The plaques were outdated, the carpeting slightly faded. Few people walked this section during the day, let alone at night. Lee listened. Silence, but not emptiness. There was still someone nearby. Someone who knew these hallways as well as he did. Lee took a deliberate step forward, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Whatever this night was building toward, he understood one thing clearly. He was no longer just observing the pattern. He had become part of it. Lee moved deeper into the older wing of the building, letting the narrowing corridors guide him rather than distract him. These halls had a different feel, less polished, more utilitarian, built for work rather than ceremony. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, spaced farther apart, leaving pockets of dimness between the fixtures. The kind of atmosphere where small movements became larger, where every shift of air could announce someone's presence. He walked with the ease of someone who recognized the architecture of silence. For years, he'd navigated political rooms where words were currency and quiet meant leverage. Tonight felt like a return to those instincts, but with one significant difference: someone else was directing the tempo. Ahead he saw a door slightly ajar, marked file storage, closed session materials. The sign had been updated recently, but the hinges were old. Lee pushed it open with 2 fingers, letting it creak softly, rather than forcing it. Inside, the room smelled of paper aging in stale air. Boxes lined the walls, labeled by committee and year. Some labels were faded, others newly stuck on top of older tags, the bureaucratic equivalent of rewriting memory. A single overhead light flickered weakly, leaving the corners submerged in shadow. Lee stepped in, scanning the titles. Nothing immediately connected to the clerk's file or the subcommittee room. But near the back of the room, he saw something that didn't belong, a single box placed on a chair rather than the shelves. Not dusty, recently moved. He approached it. The lid wasn't on properly. It sat slightly crooked, like someone had lifted it and set it back without securing the edges. Lee removed the lid entirely. Inside were transcripts, dozens of them, typed summaries of old closed-door meetings, none stamped final, drafts that were never meant to circulate. He flipped through them slowly. Most were procedural, some irrelevant, but midway through the stack, he found a transcript with a familiar signature block. Unsigned, but labeled with the initials of someone whose name he hadn't seen in years. It was the same committee member circled in the clerk's file. The date on the transcript matched the same legislative window. Lee's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't about the bill itself. It was about the conversations around it. Conversations that never made it into public record. He turned the page. There, near the bottom, was a single line underlined faintly in pencil. Request to revisit procedural deviation pending. No follow-up, no explanation, no initials from the clerk. A loose end frozen in time. As Lee closed the folder, he felt the shift again, not in the room, but in the air outside it. A soft pressure, a subtle presence. He set the transcripts down and moved toward the doorway. From the corridor came a faint metallic tap, like the edge of a key brushing a railing. Not loud, not repeated. Just enough to announce that someone was passing through. Lee stepped into the hallway without hesitation. At the far end, a figure was turning the corner. Dark coat. Slow movement, no attempt to hide, but no invitation either. Someone who wanted to be seen only in silhouette, not in detail. The figure didn't speed up, didn't look back, simply continued walking until the corner swallowed them completely. Lee didn't pursue. He knew better. Whoever orchestrated tonight wasn't fleeing. They were pacing him, setting down fragments for him to discover, and watching how he interpreted them. He stood there a moment, letting the building steady around him. Then he slipped his hands into his coat pockets, feeling the brass key resting lightly against his finger. Whatever door it opened, it wasn't just a lock. It was the next step in someone else's design. And now, unmistakably, it was his move. Lee remained still for a moment, letting the fading echo of the figure's footsteps disperse down the corridor. He wasn't unnerved. If anything, the presence of another operator in the building at this hour confirmed something he had begun to suspect. Tonight wasn't about surprise. It was about sequence. Someone wanted him to move through these halls in a particular order, encountering each clue in its intended place. He began walking again, this time toward the direction the figure had taken, but not to follow. Lee moved at his own pace, studying the walls, the doors, the subtle shifts in the building that would make sense only to someone with his years of institutional familiarity. The Capitol was never truly silent, even at night. Pipes clicked, vents breathed. Old panels expanded and settled, but amid all that natural noise, Lee listened for something else, the deliberate rhythm of human presence. At the next intersection he found evidence of it, a door marked internal stowage. Authorized staff only had been propped open by a folded piece of cardboard, an improvised wedge, used by someone who expected to return. Lee nudged the door fully open and scanned the room inside. It was small, narrow, with tall metal cabinets lining both sides. Most doors were locked, but one stood slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible between the frame and the cabinet wall. Lee walked toward it. The cabinet door bore a faint scratch near the handle, fresh and uneven. Inside, the shelves held stacks of envelopes and sealed folders, organized by year. He reached up and pulled one of the folders free. It was labeled with a date that matched the one circled in the clerk's file. This time, the pencil markings weren't inside the folder. They were on the metal shelf itself. A small, nearly invisible vertical line, a second one beside it, and a third. 3 marks. Someone wanted him to find this cabinet. Lee replaced the folder exactly where he had found it and closed the door quietly. Nothing about this operation was clumsy. Whoever was ahead of him was meticulous, patient, and familiar enough with the building to navigate without hesitation. He stepped back into the hallway, and that was when he heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a door farther down the corridor closing with controlled pressure. Not a slam, not an accidental bump. Someone had eased it shut, knowing the acoustics of the hallway, well enough to make it barely audible. Lee walked in that direction, his expression unreadable. He passed 2 committee workrooms, an unused copy room, and a stairwell entrance. Then, just outside the old Legislative Correspondence Office, he noticed something odd, a thin ribbon of warm light, leaking from beneath the door. He reached for the handle, but stopped. Footsteps were approaching, not hurried, measured. Someone coming toward him, not aware. Lee stepped aside, positioning himself in the shadow of a structural column, just wide enough to conceal him from a casual glance. The footsteps grew clearer, steady, confident, accompanied by the faint rustle of a coat lining. Then the figure appeared. It wasn't the clerk, and it wasn't the shadowed observer from earlier. It was someone Lee recognized only faintly, an older committee staffer he had seen years ago, now moving with the calm of someone who belonged in these halls, even at this hour. The man stopped at the correspondence office door, his hand hovering just above the knob. Then, as though sensing the slight disturbance Lee made merely by being present, the staffer turned his head, not toward Lee, not directly, but toward the space where Lee stood hidden, as if acknowledging the possibility without confirming it. The man didn't speak, didn't enter the room. He simply adjusted his coat sleeve, lowered his hand and walked away, disappearing down the corridor with steady steps. Lee waited until the sound faded. Then he stepped out from the shadows and turned toward the door. The man had paused at the one leaking faint, deliberate light. Whatever waited behind it was the next piece of a story someone wanted him to see. And Lee Atwater, methodical as ever, reached for the handle. Lee turned the doorknob slowly, letting the mechanism rotate without a sound. The room's faint glow spilled outward as the door eased open, revealing a narrow office lined with low filing cabinets and a single desk lamp burning at its dimmest setting. The atmosphere inside felt different from the rest of the building, more deliberate, as though someone had prepared the space for a brief visit rather than long-term work. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the soft click absorbing into the carpeted floor. The desk was clean except for one item placed precisely at its center, a small, unmarked envelope. No seal, no label, no committee stamp, just a plain envelope that could have contained anything or nothing. Lee approached it without haste. He didn't sit. He remained standing, letting his height lean over the desk as he studied the envelope for any subtle identifiers. The paper stock was old, slightly yellowed along the edges. Not new, not recent. The kind of stationery used before digital memos overtook paper trails. He slid the envelope closer. Inside was a single sheet folded in thirds. When he opened it, there were only 2 typed lines. Closed session materials were never properly archived. Some matters returned to their origin. No signature, no initials, Just those 2 lines. Lee's eyes held on the second sentence longer than the first. It wasn't a threat, nor was it an accusation. It was a statement, a quiet reminder that political decisions had a strange way of circling back to the people present at their making, even decades later. He folded the sheet again and slipped it into his coat. Only then did he notice something else in the room, a low hum coming from the opposite wall. A thin strip of light glowed along the floor, where a secondary door sat slightly misaligned in its frame. It wasn't meant to be left ajar. Lee crossed the room, pausing just before touching the door. He leaned in, listening. No voices, no movement, but the quiet felt heavy, occupied, but recently empty. He pushed the door gently. It opened into a compact storage alcove. Tall metal drawers lined the walls, each labeled with codes rather than names. Most were locked, but one drawer on the far right was open by an inch, a sliver of darkness revealing the outline of manila folders inside. Lee pulled the drawer open further. There, in the center, sat a small metal lockbox. Its surface was scratched, old, and covered with a thin layer of dust, except for the area near the latch, which was clean. Someone had opened it recently. He lifted the lockbox and set it on the small counter beside the drawer. The box had no combination wheel, only a simple keyhole, old-fashioned, basic, but secure enough for internal use. Lee reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the brass key he had found earlier. He didn't hesitate. He inserted the key. It turned smoothly, without resistance. The lid opened with a soft metallic sigh. Inside there were 3 items: a short stack of unsigned committee notes, typed but never finalized, a small cassette tape, its label blank except for a date, faint, almost washed out, a torn fragment of a transcript with a pencil slash identical to the marks in the clerk's file. Lee's hand hovered over the tape for a moment, not because he feared it, because he recognized the significance of someone placing it here for him. Only one person could have known where to leave such materials. Only one person would have known he would follow the clues tonight. Lee closed the box slowly, but left the key inside. He didn't need it anymore. Then he heard it, the quiet shift of air beneath the door behind him. Someone was standing in the main office again, waiting, not hiding. Lee set the box down silently, straightened his coat and turned toward the doorway. The light in the next room flickered. Tonight's path wasn't finished. Lee stepped back through the narrow doorway into the main office, letting the faint shadows settle around him. The room felt different now, less static, as if someone had recently been inside and left their intention behind. The desk lamp cast a soft, amber circle across the carpet, and within that light stood a detail he hadn't noticed earlier, an indentation in the fibers, the unmistakable outline of a shoe print. Not the clerk's, not his own. Someone else had stood right there, facing the desk, watching the envelope he'd opened. Lee let the silence breathe. A faint mechanical hum from the building's ventilation drifted overhead, but beneath it, he sensed something else. A waiting tension, the kind that came when 2 paths were designed to intersect without ever fully crossing. He moved toward the door leading back into the hallway. When he opened it, the corridor felt colder. A soft draft brushed past him, carrying with it the lingering scent of old cigarette smoke. The same brand he'd smelled in earlier hallways, the same faint trace left by someone who'd walked just ahead of him tonight. He turned left, toward the dimmest end of the corridor, where the overhead lights flickered inconsistently. The soles of his shoes made only the softest whisper on the carpet. The hall stretched long and empty, but he sensed the presence of movement, not in front of him, not behind him, but along the edges of the night itself. Halfway down, he found the source of the draft, a service door slightly ajar leading toward the older mechanical wing of the building. That part of the Capitol wasn't used often. It was where maintenance crews kept spare parts, outdated equipment, and the kind of forgotten storage rooms that held decades of unindexed paper. Lee pushed the door open with the back of his hand. The space beyond was dimly lit by a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Its glow revealed narrow pathways between tall metal shelves, all lined with sealed cardboard boxes. Dust danced in the air, but the path nearest the entrance was clear someone had walked through recently. He followed the path until he reached a small open area in the center of the storage room. A wooden table stood there, old and uneven, its surface marred by years of use. On it sat a single object, a capital visitor badge, the kind issued to non-staff, temporary, anonymous, generic. The date stamped on it was today's. Lee lifted the badge. The plastic was still warm as if recently held. When he turned it over, he noticed a faint pencil mark along the edge, another slash, identical to the ones in the clerk's file. Not random, not careless, a signature of intention. He slipped the badge into his coat, the same pocket that held the note from the office upstairs. As he did, something shifted in the shadows behind the far shelving unit. Not footsteps, not a voice, just the subtle displacement of air from someone stepping away. Lee didn't chase the shadow. He simply walked toward the nearest structural column and leaned slightly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the uneven light. The movement had stopped. Whoever was there knew the room too well to reveal themselves by accident. Instead, a different sound drifted through the space, distant, muffled but unmistakable. An elevator bell. Lee turned his head sharply. The nearest elevator wasn't connected to this service area. It was the freight elevator on the far side of the wing, the one used only by maintenance crews or by people who preferred to move without being seen. He retraced his steps through the storage room, pushing back through the service door and emerging into the main corridor. The air felt tighter now, the building humming with a rhythm that made sense only to those who navigated it after hours. He walked toward the freight elevator hallway. As he turned the final corner, the elevator doors were just beginning to close. Through the narrowing gap, he caught a glimpse of a silhouette, a coat collar raised, a face turned away, a figure who knew exactly when to arrive and when to vanish. The doors sealed shut with a quiet metallic sigh. Lee didn't press the call button. He didn't need to. Whoever was guiding tonight's path wanted him to follow the evidence, not the person. And Lee Atwater, methodical as always, understood the true destination wasn't the elevator. It was whatever waited after he pieced all of this together. Lee stood quietly in front of the freight elevator, watching the last vibration settle through the metal doors. The hallway around him felt strangely hollow, as if the building itself had exhaled after guiding him through a night it had been waiting years to revisit. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, feeling the cold brass key in one and the warm visitor badge in the other. Two artifacts from a story that didn't belong to the present. It refused to stay in the past. He didn't chase the elevator. He simply turned away, moving down the corridor with steady steps, the echoes folding softly behind him. Each object he carried, each room he'd entered, each shadow he'd glimpsed, had pointed toward something unfinished, something quietly handed from one set of hands to another. At the far end of the hallway, a single window overlooked the Capitol grounds. Lee stopped there, the night stretching out in muted tones beyond the glass. Lights shimmered faintly across the lawn, steady and indifferent, as if the world outside remained unaware of the small, deliberate signals that had stirred beneath its surface. He rested the visitor badge on the windowsill and let it go. It lay there silently, absorbing the glow of the exit signs behind him. Some Mars didn't return because history demanded them. They returned because someone decided the time was right for them to be seen again. And as Lee walked back into the empty corridor, the building returned to its quiet state, not resolved, not troubled, just holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next.